Center, where our office is right around the corner here. And I'm really happy to see so many people here for Omid Safi's talk this evening, the first of our public humanities lectures of the year. I have to give a couple of special thanks before I introduce our speaker. One is to the Department of Religion, that's helping to sponsor this. Also to the chaplain's office, who helped to bring Professor Safi here to us. And finally to the Middle Eastern Studies Initiative, the third of our sponsors on campus. But most importantly, to the Ira Wender family for endowing the Ira Wender Visitor in Cultural Understanding. This gift supports funding for a recognized scholar and expert who will meet with students and faculty and engage in sustained and meaningful discussion about issues of cultural understanding pertaining to the Middle East. And Omid Safi has certainly fulfilled that role already. I think he's probably lucky he's from the South right now. He must feel like he's in a Virginia reel of events today. He's gone from classroom to meeting with faculty, to meeting with students, and he's done it all with such gracious goodwill. So thank you so much for your participation in many aspects of our life here at Carleton. So our guest tonight is ideal for the purpose of the Ira Wender Fund. Omid Safi is Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He received his MA and PhD from Duke University in religion with a concentration in Islamic studies. His work at Chapel Hill, teaching, doing research, mentoring PhD students, has included both contemporary Islamic thought and medieval Islamic history. Omid is the editor of the volume Progressive Muslims on Justice, Gender, and Pluralism, which offered an understanding of Islam rooted in social justice, gender equality, and religious and ethnic pluralism. His works, Politics of Knowledge in Pre-Modern Islam, dealing with medieval Islamic history and politics, and Voices of Islam, Voices of Change, were both published in 2006. And his last book, Memories of Muhammad, deals with the biography and legacy of the Prophet Muhammad. He has forthcoming volumes on the famed mystic Rumi, contemporary Islamic debates in Iran, and American Islam. So you can see that he is a prolific scholar and a very diverse scholar in his interests and accomplishments. But, and importantly for us here tonight, he has also maintained a very active role as a public humanities figure and scholar. And last year's Humanities Center Faculty Research Seminar was in fact on the varieties of public humanities. One of the things that seminar focused on, and that we really concentrate here at Carleton on, is showing not just that we can talk about the value of the humanities in the public realm, but that our work in the humanities in the public realm is important and meaningful. And here too, Omid Safi's work has been exemplary. He's served on the board of the Pluralism Project at Harvard University and is the co-chair of the steering committee for the study of Islam at the American Academy of Religion. Omid has been among the most frequently sought speakers on Islam in popular media, appearing in the New York Times, Newsweek, Washington Post, PBS, NPR, etc., and international media as well. He writes for posts and blogs regularly at religionnews.com. And here I just want to pause for a second to note his most recent blog post was on the 10-year anniversary of the passing of the great scholar Edward Said. And I think that's particularly interesting for us because that Edward Said's book, Humanism and Democratic Criticism, was one of the first books that the Steering Committee of the Humanities Center read together to identify our mission. So there's a wonderful resonance there. He writes in that blog post, "Here is one of the themes that I have taken away from Said, the need for us all to be engaged in criticism, a profoundly humanistic engagement. Criticism must think of itself as life-enhancing and constitutively opposed to every form of tyranny, domination, and abuse. Its social goals are non-coercive knowledge produced in the interests of human freedom." So what a lovely way to encapsulate the work of Edward Said and Omid Safi as well. So please join me in giving a real welcome to Omid Safi.
Well, thank you, friends, for taking time out of your busy lives to come to this occasion for us to be together. I have this very trite way of beginning each and every public talk that I'm asked to give, and it is actually completely sincere and something that comes out of the depth of my own commitment as a Muslim, which is to begin by thanking people for the gift of your time. One of the ethical teachings of the Islamic tradition is the awareness that the number of breaths that we get to take in our lifetime is what we refer to as maktub. It's prescribed. And no power on earth can add or subtract a single breath from what is intended for us. In light of that awareness, the decision for 100 of us to come together for an hour and talk about issues that confront our communities is something that I take seriously as an ethical commitment. We could have done many different things with this hour, particularly in a day that's as beautiful and gorgeous as today. So my own hope and prayer for this time together is that it be a time that leaves us kinder, gentler, more aware of our interconnectedness, and more aware of the extraordinarily difficult tasks that we have ahead of us in order to be able to live in the kind of world that our children and our children's children deserve to grow up in. I want to begin by a brief anecdote from an ethical exemplar from the Jewish tradition, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a very close friend of Dr. King, a person that I will refer to at different points of this talk. And as many of you are probably aware, Rabbi Heschel was someone who raised his own voice against the horror of the Vietnam War. And in doing so, stood hand in hand, arm in arm, next to Dr. King, and famously prayed with his feet by marching in Selma. There was one time when he was asked to speak about his opposition to the war in Vietnam, that a journalist who didn't know too much about Heschel, didn't know too much about the depth of his Jewish commitment, came up to him and said, Rabbi, what are you doing here? With that robe and that beard and that hair. If you've seen him, he looks kind of like Gandalf. That's the sort of presence. And Heschel gave this response to this journalist, which I don't think the journalist entirely understood. He said, I'm here because I cannot pray. And the journalist paused and said, what do you mean? You're a rabbi, you're a scholar, what do you mean you can't pray? And Heschel said, my friend, you don't understand. Every time that I open up my prayer books, I see in it images of Vietnamese children burning in napalm. Until I do something to bring an end to their suffering, I cannot pray as I ought to pray. And that is the starting point of what I want us to spend this hour talking about. The need for what we refer to as a prophetic voice within American public discourse. This prophetic tradition has a profound legacy in many of our traditions. It is there in the Bible, it's there so emphatically in the Jewish tradition, in the Christian tradition that Martin represents, in the Islamic tradition of the Prophet Muhammad. You see it also in the traditions of Gandhi and others. A prophet never comes to his or her community to say, you're doing great. Status quo, baby. Don't change a thing. P.S. hashtag God is particularly pleased with the way that you're treating orphans and widows and strangers. Nice job. That is not what prophets do. Heschel says that the task of a prophet is to be a scream in the middle of the night. Someone who stands up in front of his own community and says, unless you can be right with God's children, you cannot be right with God. That there is a path to God, but it goes through humanity. Now, voices of conscience like that come right out of our ethical tradition, pose a profound moral, ethical, political, economic challenge to our comfort, to the ways in which we've come to accept certain things as just the way things are. And societies have these tricks up their sleeve to avoid dealing with this prophetic challenge. Gandhi has a nice way of saying that when you come with this message, they might laugh at you, they might ignore you, they might fight you, then you win. At times we've seen with far too many of our prophets, they might kill you. Looking at the world in which we all inhabit, the world in which we participate in creating every day, it is a world in which 1 out of every 5 human beings lives on $1 a day. This is the world in which we are its creators. We allow this world to exist. And just so we are clear, we're not here speaking about only the suffering of God's children some other place in Africa, in India. We're also talking about here. We're talking about the richest country in the history of humanity that has 47.5 million people living below the poverty line. A poverty line that's set way too low anyway. So what do we do with voices like Heschel, voices like King, voices like the Prophet Muhammad, who come and they bring this ethical challenge to society? We can ignore them, we can mock them, we can laugh at them, we can kill them. But I would actually argue that there's one ultimate cruel trick up the sleeve of the establishment. The few, the extremely few people who are benefiting from this unjust world that we've created. And that is not by ignoring them, it's not by mocking them, it's not by fighting them, and it's not even by killing them. It is rather by turning them into icons. When a prophet becomes an icon, it means that we no longer have to be morally confronted with the profound ethical challenge that they present to us. And this is precisely what we have done to our own most prominent American prophet, Martin. We're just coming out of a situation where we celebrated and honored the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. And we had the President of the United States, Nobel Peace Prize winning President of the United States, stand where Martin stood and offer us a watered-down, domesticated image of that prophetic challenge. Now, I do not intend for these words to be taken as just a personal jab at the president. There were lots of politicians there. I'm talking about us. There's a radical difference between the message of Martin and what we as Americans have become on a world stage today. And let's take a look at some of those discrepancies. First of all, we begin by talking about the March on Washington as if this was just the Martin show, instead of recognizing that it was the March for Jobs and Freedom. And the jobs part was very specific. If you look at the program that was handed out August 28, 1963, on the back of it they tell you what they want, and it was a program number 7, I think, was we want $2 an hour wages. To which our Republican friends might say, well, you know, today we got at 7 something, so we met that challenge. Except that $2 of 1963 is more like $13 to $14 an hour. It's that audacious claim that if a person works 40 hours a week, they should be able to feed their family. And we are nowhere near that. We also stopped the Martin show on the steps of Washington monuments, instead of going with Martin where he went, and realizing that he doesn't die in 1963, he dies in 1968. And in those last 5 years of his life, he becomes increasingly unpopular. So that when he dies, 72% of all Americans, and even 55% of Black Americans, disapprove of him. Why? Because Martin took the steps that I'm urging us, pleading with us to take today. That is, to have the boldness to say that the suffering here has to be seen as organically connected to the suffering there. Because the sanctity of the lives here in America are organically connected to the sanctity of the lives there. There's a reason why almost every school child in America, and I've got 4 of them, gets to hear the I Have a Dream speech. But virtually no child in a public school system is ever allowed to hear the Riverside Church speech. I teach classes of 250 people, mostly 18, 19, 20-year-olds, and every semester I ask them, how many of you have heard the I Have a Dream speech? It's virtually 100%. And then I ask them, how many of you have seen or heard the Riverside Church speech? And for the 18 to 22-year-old crowd, it's maybe 3 or 4 hands out of 250. This is not an accident. It's not an accident because what we have done is to take our American Christian prophetic voice and turn him into an icon where he's a national holiday, where there's a street named after him in almost every town, but we never have to actually confront where he ends up spending his life, and telling us that my own government, as he calls it, is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. We are unwilling to go with Martin to Riverside Church and hear him begin by saying, I have come to this magnificent house of worship because my conscience no longer permits me to remain silent. The time comes where silence is betrayal, and with respect to Vietnam, for us, that time is now. And that Martin says that there's a triplet giant evil that is hurting the soul of America. And what does it consist of? Yes, still racism, the same racism that he fought for back in Montgomery, back in Birmingham, back in Selma. But now to racism, he also adds materialism. And he ends it with militarism. And let's just take our pulse and figure out where we are. We have created an America in which the top 1% own 42% of the wealth in this country. We've created an America in which the top 400 individuals, just they could fit in a few rooms like this, own more than the bottom 150 million Americans. And if Martin objected to militarism back in 1967, what does that legacy have to say to us today, when what I'm urging you to do is to go back to Heschel, go back to Martin, take out Vietnam, and put in our endless wars in the Middle East? And just so we're clear about this is not picking a fight with the Republicans or with the Democrats. This has become our official national policy. If you remember, in the last presidential election, we had Romney and Obama disagreeing about education, disagreeing about women's rights, disagreeing about the environment, disagreeing about taxes. They could agree on two things. How much do we love Israel? And the fact that the United States of America spends more on its military than the next 12 countries combined. Yep, we do. Absolutely. Yes, sir. Yep. No disagreement here. This, my friends, is where we are. If you and I go to our elected officials and we tell them that we want adequate public housing, they will tell you we can't afford it. If you tell them that I want schools that our children can go to and actually get an adequate education, and I want to be able to pay our teachers, we can't afford it. I want to be able to preserve the planet so that places like Bangladesh don't go underwater and we don't have things like what took place in Colorado taking place. We can't afford those environmental measures. If you tell them I want to take care of our sick people, we can't afford universal health care. If you tell them I want to take care of our homeless, we can't afford to do that. But somehow we can afford to spend $680 billion a year on our military budget, and that doesn't even include the extra dispensations for the wars. I'm a fairly smart person, but my mind can't fathom numbers like $4,000 billion spent on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Something is wrong with us if we say we don't have money for housing, don't have money for education, don't have money for healthcare, don't have money for sick people, but we've got money for these wars that do not end, drain our resources, and kill tens of thousands of people over there that we don't even bother counting. That we don't bother counting. That is our official policy. Going back to the Bush administration, when somebody asked him when the war in Iraq started, General Frank, how many people do you think of Iraqis have died? His response was, we don't do body counts. By which he meant, we don't do Iraqi body counts. We are participants in a world in which we're spending $5 billion a year, that they tell us, on drones. And just to put things in perspective, for every hour that one of these drones flies around, dropping bombs on people without due process, every hour of that costs as much as we pay a teacher to teach our children. Somehow, some way, now, we have to begin by connecting these dots. There's a reason why the richest nation on earth is broke, and you and I are broke. If you're a student, I know you go to Carleton, and you're going to like one of the best damn schools in the whole country. The system is crumbling. College kids are coming out with loans that they cannot afford to pay, with jobs that are not there for them. And somewhere along the way, we have to be able to say, the reason why we have inadequate education, inadequate housing, inadequate policies, is because the richest nation on the planet keeps sending thousands of billions of dollars over there to fight unjust wars that offer profit for the military-industrial complex. What did we hear on the 50th anniversary about Martin? Nothing about the Riverside Church, Martin. Nothing about drones. We heard about racism. And it's a good thing that I live in the South, and now the Supreme Court of the United States has told us that racism is over. And we can just gut the civil rights legislation of what it needed. And people in my home state of North Carolina are entirely too happy to go to work and to make sure that no black person ever gets to vote again. Or at least as many of them as they can possibly keep from voting. They're happy to go to work and find out where do young people live in colleges. And to eliminate every early registration attempt and same-day voting, and to put one voting spot in college towns and have it have 11 parking spots. This is how democracy dies. What I'm asking you to do is to take seriously the moral and ethical challenge that the Martins of the world present to us when they say things like, a nation that continues to spend more on its military than it does on programs of social uplift is approaching, Martin's words, spiritual death. Now, this country is blessed. This country is blessed with so many things. It's blessed with beautiful trees, wide open earth, kind people, decent food in some parts, rivers and mountains and beaches. You're also blessed with your own indigenous religious tradition, which is not a matter of history books, but it's a matter of something that is still found in your midst. The question is, if we're willing to take it seriously, if we're willing to engage it, though it's uncomfortable for us. So why am I, as a Muslim, as a person that has spent his life studying Islamic studies, taking the first 20 minutes of my talk and talking with you about Martin and America and empire and militarism? What most people in my situation do is to rattle off the ills that are directed against what they perceive to be their own community. And I could do that. I could stand in front of you and tell you that immediately after September the 11th, in polls that ABC News took, 39% of Americans said, we don't like Muslims. Don't want them near us, don't want my daughter dating them, don't want them as my neighbor. We've got thousands of scholars and activists and ministers, thank you, rabbis, imams, priests, teaching, educating, preaching, starting with the young, going to the old. Today, the number of Americans who openly say, we do not like us some Muslims, don't want them near us, don't want our daughter dating them, don't want them as our neighbor, is 49%. It's worse now than it was right after September 11th. And if you know anything about these kinds of studies, you would know that generally people tend to underreport their prejudice. I could talk to you about the ways in which in 2008, when Barack Obama was running for president, all of a sudden he discovered that he had a middle name, and he became Barack Hussein Obama. And being a Muslim, or the son of a Muslim, or an alleged Muslim, became a slur. And how long it took. And it wasn't just coming from nasty right-wing Republicans, it also came from Hillary's camp. And it finally took someone like Colin Powell to stand up and say, so what? So what? So what? He's not a Muslim, he's actually a Christian, but so what? Is there anything about being a Muslim that would disqualify someone from aspiring to be the President of the United States of America? If you want to look at where we are now, we're now living in a situation where my tax dollars and your tax dollars are used by the New York Police Department to spy on a community on the sheer basis of their religious identity. We're talking about following Muslim kids into falafel joints and kebab places, and designating mosques, entire mosques, as terrorist organizations so that we could wiretap them. This is our official policy. This is what we're doing to one another. I could tell you not just about what we tend to talk about, which is airport humor, right? There's a whole genre of Muslim airport humor, of like you walk in and you get profiled, right? And there should be stand-up routines sort of about this as part of how we make sense of this nonsense. Sadly, some of our screening friends don't have a sense of humor, right? I flew from Raleigh to Minneapolis, and I go into the Raleigh airport, and the guy comes up, and he goes, I need to frisk you, do you mind? And my first thought, of course, is, you? No, sir. She? Absolutely. And then just in that last nanosecond, that little angelic voice of reason, my mother kicks in and said, Omid, honey, save it. Save it for later. These people don't have a sense of humor. So, brother, yes, sir, please go ahead and feel. We're not talking about airports. We're talking about citizenship. We're talking about everything ranging from stop and frisk in New York City, where 90% of people who stop are Black and Latino, to the surveillance that's proposed by, that has already been done, and as far as we know is still continuing by the NYPD, You can go down to Guantanamo, where we're still keeping 164 Muslim men who have been there for years and no charge has been brought against them. They have never been offered an opportunity to defend themselves in a court of law, even if that court of law is a kangaroo court. I could rattle off our numbers on drones. And let's just be clear, when we're speaking about drones, what we're talking about. We're not just talking about something that W did. We're talking about President Obama, Nobel Peace Prize winning President Obama, ordering 8 times, 10 times as many drones as President Bush ever did. We're talking about these drones killing more people than Al-Qaeda killed on 9/11. In multiple countries, unmanned planes fly overhead and drop missiles that have names like Hellfire on entire families. And our official government policy is, if we killed you and you're an adult male, you were a terrorist. That is our policy in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in Yemen. And the numbers are extraordinary. We're talking about 371 strikes in Pakistan alone. 371 explosions that killed close to 3,500 people. Some of them, no doubt, members of Al-Qaeda. Included in that number are 200 children. Now, you want to have the rest of the world move from looking at the United States as the beacon of hope and freedom and democracy to thinking of us as this is that bully that drops hellfire missiles on children. And the explanation that we've always given is we do our very best. These are smart bombs. What would Martin say? Martin told us we have smart bombs but misguided policies. I want to know why we as Americans are silent about this. Where is our love for our democracy? Where is our outrage? Go back to Martin and read the letter from Birmingham jail. There can be no great disappointment where there's also not great love. I'm urging us to action, not out of the hatred of our country or who we have become, but precisely out of the concern that grows out of love, and say, we want to be better than what we have allowed ourselves to become. And I want to be clear about this. I'm not asking us to do this because we are killing Muslims or imprisoning them or profiling them. That is the symptom. Today, that kind of violence is directed against Muslims, against Hispanics, against gays and lesbians. Before, it was directed against Jews, against Irish, against Mormons, against blacks, against women, against Native Americans. Nor do I want to wait until some other community can come so we can begin hating and killing them, freeing up Muslims. I want us to deal with that underlying issue, which is the deadly arrogance of thinking that our lives matter more than the lives of other fellow human beings. Martin spent his life struggling against the myth of racial superiority, the notion that by the virtue of the color of your skin, you were somehow better and entitled to more than others. And I would like to hope that we, as a national community, have gotten to the point where we're no longer tolerant of people who say things like that in public. We might have begun to deal with the issue of racial supremacy, but we are nowhere near the issue of dealing with national supremacy. This lingering, stubborn myth that America is somehow exceptional, that somehow God has shed his grace on thee. Instead of saying, if God has shed his grace, her grace on thee to exactly and identically the same measure, God has shed God's grace on every other block of humanity. This arrogance of national exceptionalism is a myth that we have to fight with every bit of conviction that we have, on par with fighting racism and sexism and homophobia. One small indication of it is take a look at our policies about Syria. Syria, that bloody mess, where 100,000 human beings have been slaughtered in the last 2 years. And I'm not, as I hope it's apparent, one of those right-wing Republicans who's just waiting for Obama to say something and bash him no matter what he says. But I want us to grapple with the logic that says we are not going to draw a red line when 100,000 people die, but we're going to draw a red line when 1,400 people die from a chemical weapon attack. Why? Because when people die from chemical weapons, those weapons could fall into what the president and his policymakers call the wrong hands. And they could cross national borders, and they could begin killing our allies, and maybe eventually Americans. As if there's any such thing as a right pair of hands that chemical weapons could fall into. We are, for now, until China, the world's remaining superpower. When these devastating humanitarian crises happen in Rwanda, in Darfur, in Syria, there's one of two options. Either, as the world's lone military superpower, you intervene in every humanitarian crisis, which we don't do. Or, delegate that power to the and you empower it to intervene, not because that country has oil, not because it's next to Israel, and not because it fits somebody's geopolitical interest, but because God's children are under assault. That is the conversation that we should be having. That if chemical weapons are such a red line, why is our own nation the largest producer of weapons of mass destruction on the face of the planet? If chemical weapons and nuclear weapons are so wrong, why do we insist on not eliminating them from the entire region just because it's our allies, Pakistan, India, and Israel, which are known to have them? If you take a look at the Middle East, at the regions in which we are involved and we have been involved, these inconsistencies where we have put geopolitical interest over and above and ahead of any genuine commitment to the sanctity of human life shows its ugly head region after region after region. You can start in Iran, where we overthrew a democratically elected prime minister in 1953 because he had the audacity to claim that Iranian oil belongs to Iranians. And we said, no, no, Iranian oil actually belongs to British and American companies at a 90% profit. We overthrew him and established a king that Human Rights Watch said has the worst record of human rights in the entire world. I mean, that's like being the South Carolina of education. Like, of all the dictators out there, you are the worst violator of things. And this was the person we called our closest ally in the region. Move over to Afghanistan, where President Reagan invites the Mujahideen into the White House and compares them to America's own founding fathers. You can take the Mujahideen, you can break them up and put them back together, and we call that put back together group the Taliban. Why did we support the Mujahideen? Because they were fighting our enemy. And the enemy of our enemy, I guess, is RI. Instead of actually looking at their teaching and their practices. You can move westward to Iraq, where before we put the pictures of Saddam Hussein on the cover of Time magazine in exactly the same way that we had done with Hitler, we decided to send Donald Rumsfeld to Baghdad to shake his bloody hand. And after they had already used chemical weapons, and after we knew that they were going to use chemical weapons, we, as the United States, gave coordinates of the Iranian army to the Iraqis so that they could use chemical weapons against them. Or seem to have no love in their hearts. He tells us that love without power is anemic and sentimental. But power without love is reckless and abusive. So what he leaves us with is that power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. That justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. If that's too fancy, and we want to put it in simpler term, listen to Brother West. When he says, justice is what love looks like in public. That's all we're talking about when we're calling for justice. Justice for the least of these, justice in our own nation, and justice halfway around the world. We're talking about what love would look like in public. A love that begins with God, flows through us, and is going to someday take us back there. And there is an urgency to this. Not to save my people, but to save all of us. And to save that as of yet unfinished American dream. America, for Martin, was an unfinished dream that could turn into a nightmare, but it could yet be realized. That time is now, because we're in a greater danger of collapsing as an unjust empire today than we were in Martin's age. We, as Americans, have to be willing to stand up and say, love and empire don't mix. Empire and democracy don't mix. We have to pick one. Do we want to be a just democratic nation and a responsible citizen of the world, or do we want to be an empire? We cannot be both. And what Martin leaves you with, and what I'm going to leave you with, is when he says, cowardice asks you whether something is safe. Expediency asks you if it's politic. It's politically doable. Vanity asks you if it's popular. But conscience asks you, is it right? And a time comes when you have to do something, not because it's safe, or politic, or popular, but because it is right. That time for us is now. What is at stake is not just the lives of those thousands of people in the Middle East who might die in their own wars or in the hellfire that we bring to them. It's the fate of our own American dream. You've heard every American politician end their speeches by saying, God bless America. You've occasionally heard the prophetic voice that says, unless you do this, God will damn America. What I'm urging you to do is not to bless America and not to damn America. It's to be true to that prophetic voice that was at the heart of Martin's message when in 1957 he founded the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and their motto was to save the soul of America, to redeem America. And Martin says, if someday America's soul dies and we do an autopsy on it, the results are going to come back war. War killed the soul of America. Instead of waiting for politicians to keep telling us, God bless America, I'm asking you to become participants in redemption of this beautiful but imperfect place, and to realize that the way we're going to get there has to begin by abandoning this death-like ambition of an empire and instead turn into a responsible citizen of this very small planet. Thank you for the gift of your time. Thank you for your patience. There are lots of great snacks over there, so feel free to do that. And I'm happy to stand here.
I also want to point out that Omid Safi is also here as part of a series of talks that we had on censorship, free speech, and blasphemy. And tomorrow at noon, he's going to be talking in the library at Athenaeum with Arnaud Chapradar specifically about the context of censorship and blasphemy in regards to Salman Rushdie and the Rushdie affair. And so he will also have a chance to talk with all of you on his perspective on that. So it's at noon tomorrow in the Athenaeum. Let me, if you don't mind, have you take a couple questions here, and then we have ample time and opportunity to just circulate out there in the lobby for people to ask questions and gather around and have additional conversation. Questions right after that?
Yes, sir.
There's a saying in many traditions, religious traditions, that the devil is in the details. And I was very sympathetic to everything you said today, but in the back of my head, I'm troubled by the detail. And I wonder if you would take one place, let's say Egypt right now, and American policy towards Egypt, and how could anyone make a decision based on your principles, which I admire and fully agree with, to a situation where I just can't see any, I wouldn't know how to choose to support the Morsi side or support the general side. I find it extremely difficult.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question, which is fair, and it's a reasonable question that all of us have to be grappling with. Let me begin, as is oftentimes my tendency, from that place of a deep connection to a religious tradition. Bishop Desmond Tutu, in speaking about how to confront apartheid, something that was woven into the fabric of his own society, was institutionalized and legalized, and people said, how can you keep fighting against something when there's no way out of it? And he said, sir, that's precisely the definition of faith. Faith is hope in the unseen. We have to have hope in the possibility of a just tomorrow, though my eyes can't see it today. I start with the assumption that the unjust reality that we see in Egypt, in Syria, in Palestine, Israel, in Iran, in so many places, is not how we're always bound to be. It's not how we've always been, and it's not how we have to be in the future. I actually have the audacity to claim that God wants us to live together in a just peace. But rather than beginning with saying, here's the solution to Syria, here's the solution to Egypt, I would want us to have that structural conversation, which is we need to have a conversation about the role of the United States in the world. We are not a responsible member of an international community. We are not, at an environmental level, at a nuclear level, at a humanitarian level, fulfilling all the responsibilities that we have. When it comes to a place like Egypt, you're exactly right that we're caught between, do we support Morsi or do we support the Sisi side, which, what did they just do? They banned all the activities of the Muslim Brotherhood, including TV networks and newspapers. Now, I might have some issues with my Republican friends. Okay, both of them, I have two. I call them the tokens. Keep them, just to, keep my circle diverse. But if somebody wanted to come and say, we're going to ban the Republican Party and prevent them from publishing their ideas and appearing on television and radio, I would hope that even those of us who are passionately opposed to their ideas would say that would violate the very spirit of a democracy. And we in the United States have tools at our disposal. And one of them is money. Egypt is the second largest recipient of US foreign aid. Now, that's a little deceptive, because in reality, that money doesn't go to the people of Egypt. That money, our Our tax money goes to the government. The American government gives it to Egypt so that Egypt can hand it back to the American military-industrial complex. In other words, the arrangement that we have is for you and I to be paying Lockheed Martin. And I don't want to be paying Lockheed Martin. I don't want that blood money on my hands. So one of the systematic things that we have to change is we have tools of persuasion. We can say, yes, we're willing to support Egypt and other countries, provided that you meet a certain standard of human rights. Provided that your journalists are free to do their job. And if that way of appealing to people is a starting point, I'm willing to bet you that quite a few countries would say, well, you know, we really would like to crush these journalists who keep exposing all of our corruption, but I want that $2 billion even more. Ultimately, it's actually the position of privilege that the United States has today, which I think is unsustainable. We're 5% of the world's population. We use up about 25% of many of the world's resources. So even that unipolar place of privilege that we have, in the long run, is not sustainable. From the simplest, not moral, but military levels, you can read the works of people like Andrew Bosevich, the military historian. We're not even winning wars anymore. Because we can't, because we're spread too thin. Even our empire strategy is no longer effective, plus the fact that we're now confronted with an enemy which is no longer a conventional nation state. It's a nation-less, cell-based group that's in 50 different countries. We need a different model. And for me, the greatest hope that we have is not to keep pumping more money and more resources into our militarism. It's to actually invest in a just planet, just policies, just internationally related policies, what Martin would call, again, the worldwide perspective. But the starting point of it for me would be, how about as a start, we say, we're not going to fund any more dictators. Not in Iraq, not in Egypt, not in Palestine, Israel, not in Pakistan. We're going to put our money invested in an international aid relief effort from the United Nations. And the aid that we offer to countries is not going to be military aid. It's going to be education aid, humanitarian aid. It's that longer process as opposed to dealing with just the present conflict here and there. I know I'm not giving you a whole lot of detail. Mind you, I'm not a politician. I'm not an international relations person. Just a simple kid who wants kids all over the world to live together in peace. And I happen to think that living together is more natural for us than killing each other permanently. Yes?
Well, and also to build on some of your things, which was excellent. You just were speaking so many new things that, as a Christian, have just bothered me because I feel a calling to the message you said. That one of the Christian principles, and it goes for nations and individuals, and it really fits with Egypt and the things you were talking about, is you can't go tell somebody else about their sins. I mean, American Christians are a little too fixated on the sins that other people commit. But where Christianity has power is that you as a sinner who recognizes your own failures, your own things that you have done, as you admit that, you then can share in that as other people struggle. Well, we have no moral authority in the world until, as you said, we admit our role in what Egypt is today, our role into what Iran is today. I mean, I would love it if Obama understood history. I'm like you, I think does this man not read? Do we not have leaders that know history? that we could go, I would just love to see if we went into where we have Israel and the Palestinians and talked about history, how both were wrong. We could go into Egypt and say, you know, we're part of this, and this is what we did wrong, but it's a new day, and we're gonna admit our wrongs, and because it's hard to tell someone, give up your weapons when we, the day that Newtown happened, the weapon that was used to kill little children went up in sales. I mean, what kind of country is that? You know, to tell someone else about their weapons. Who are we to tell people about their human rights when we have done so much? We have no moral authority, and that is what you're talking about, is that if we have no moral authority, because I remember Robbie saying, we don't apologize for anything. And I thought, is that right? How can a person who struggles with alcohol change unless they admit their failure?
And I agree with everything that you said. If I can push it one step further, I would like us to be more than simply saying we have no moral authority. And I want us to go back to Heschel, when Heschel says, few are guilty, but all are responsible. That's actually where I want us to be, right? Admit your guilt, but even if it's not our guilt, to say, I'm still responsible. I am my brothers and my sisters' keeper in that sense. And that's particularly true if we have the means to do so much. Yes, sir.
I live outside of the Washington, D.C. area, and many of my colleagues and back at home, and many of my peers have friends who are parents or in the part of the military-industrial complex, so to speak. I have a friend of mine whose mother, I think, works at Lockheed, actually, in Bethesda, Maryland. And many of my colleagues who now also want to go into engineering, they definitely want to work for these companies or for the military. And it's often, and now that you've mentioned the idea of the encroaching military-industrial complex and how, in a way, this is sort of morally corrupting our nation. How is it that we could start, because I know many people's economic lives, and in fact the economy of Washington, D.C. is so dependent on the military-industrial complex, how could we start shifting in a positive manner or is it not possible that it would be radical to have to shift the people away, and there may have to be some short-term economic hurt? How do we manage that and do it in a responsible way for our country's morale?
Well, let's begin by actually redeeming that word radical. I mean, you say, would it be a radical shift? Yes, it's a radical shift, but the word radical doesn't have to scare us, right? Martin himself, I've read in the whole of my life, I've read one thing from Playboy. I didn't have pictures. And it was Martin's interview in Playboy magazine, where he talked about his embrace of these terms, radical and extremist. And he said, when I was young, I didn't really like to be called an extremist. But the more I thought about it, I thought, is there something not radical and extreme in Jesus' sacrifice for humanity? So I actually think, yeah, maybe I want to be an extremist in the cause of love, an extremist in developing, and so he's appropriating that radical language and putting it in service of his nonviolence commitment. And he says, I think there's actually something beautifully radical about what he calls a dangerous kind of unselfishness, where you begin by saying, I can only be who I ought to be if you be who you ought to be. Because we're tied up together, we're connected together. Look, as far as the military-industrial complex, and Martin didn't invent that term, the first time that enters our national conversation is from Eisenhower, and he would know. War, and not just war as an event, but that's why he calls it militarism. It's the entire edifice and structure. Militarism is an addiction. It's that we have willingly injected all components of our society with. One small example of it is if you map out the military-industrial complex, it's in every state of the Union. Because they have made sure that no congressman is going to vote against the economic interest of their own district. The question that we ought to be asking is, if we want to be in the war business, when we're clearly seeing the collapse of our moral foundation, morality not defined as can two gay people get married, morality as can we take care of our sick people? Can we take care of our children? Can we take care of our elderly? Do we have homeless people? And to do the math. You can't spend $4,000 billion and do all these things. So which one do you want, America? And so far, our answer is, we want our death machines. Which, remember, the military-industrial complex is a lot like the prison-industrial complex. We used to have, 30 years ago, 400,000 people in prison. Today, we've got 2.5 million people. You've got companies, sometimes the same companies, that are building up new prisons, and it's like the hotel industry. They promise you an 85% occupancy rate. That's what they call it, occupancy rate. How can they keep building new prisons and new jails and promise you occupancy rates? They're going to find people to throw in jail. These are all forms of addiction that are a part of our society. There's an amazing book that a wonderful Christian pacifist theologian and journalist wrote, Chris Hedges, called "War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning." And he doesn't mean it as a compliment. That we have substituted our addiction to war and our tendency to define ourselves against imagined people out there for that more redemptive task of a love, fellowship, friendship, neighborliness that ought to connect us together. Okay. Maybe one last one? Yes.
Yeah, this is just a short question. An old teacher of mine used to say that when ideology hits the ground, people die. And so do you think that there is a way to introduce these radical changes into our systems of government and society without turmoil and without major strife?
As it stands right now, people are dying. As it stands right now, we have a military complex that by definition is designed to kill indiscriminately, to hold people in prisons, and to make sure that millions of people are dying from simple preventable diseases. So this current system is actually the one that's already producing dead bodies on the ground. As for the turmoil that you're talking about, yes, but the way that, again, as a child of Martin, he would put it, he goes back to the Good Samaritan story. And he says the real question, I trust most people have heard of the Good Samaritan story, so the real question that we ought to be asking ourselves is not, why did the first rabbi walk by and the second rabbi walk by, and then the Good Samaritan, who's not even a proper Jew, stopped to help the fallen victim? He says we've got to be asking the structural question, which is, why should we allow a system to exist that has an edifice that produces victims? He says it's the whole road to Jericho that is in need of radical redemption. That our system is broken and not serving us and killing people there is evident. The question is, how do we go about transforming it And can we insist on a radical transformation that is committed to a notion of nonviolence, which is not about preserving the status quo of my privilege, your privilege, our privilege, America's privilege, but actually is about moving to a model of responsible world citizenship, because that's the only sustainable model that any of us can ultimately think of. Otherwise, empires crumble.
We should let you take a break. And to remind you as well that when you have an opportunity to talk to the speaker, if you've been agreeing with the speaker, it's important to come up and talk. And if you've been disagreeing with the speaker, it's even more important to come up and ask questions. Because that's what discussion is, an engaging conversation. And that's one of the reasons that Omid agreed to stay and join us for cookies and tea and other yummy things out here in the nose. So please join us. And also please come on Sunday. The Department of Economics is hosting Marx and Soho, a play by Howard Zinn in the White Center Theater